So Julie, I think let's start. It's a bit after 9:30 and we have a wonderful group gathered. Good morning, everyone. My name is Diane Proctor and I'm the chair of the Town Government Committee, which is helping all of us to enjoy this series of reviews on the warrant, on the Concord Town Warrant. I want to remind everybody that this is being videotaped and that tape is the product, and the League of Women Voters owns that videotape. It may not be used in any way except in its entirety. It may be viewed by going to our website where under First Fridays, you can find all of our various First Fridays recorded for your pleasure and viewing. There is also the possibility that they will also be put up by MMN, which is for League people, Monday Member News, but is for the rest of the world, the Minuteman Media Network that Carlin has so brilliantly overseen, and it will be available there for everybody's viewing within a week of this showing. I think probably before that. So welcome everyone. It's wonderful to have you here. We have the privilege this morning of welcoming two of the more important women in our community, Laurie Hunter, who is the superintendent of schools, and Christine Reynolds, who is the chair of the FinCom Financial Committee. They're going to be reviewing for us various warrant issues. We're going to start with Laurie. And then we'll turn to Christine Reynolds. If you have questions, there are two ways to do it. One, raise your hand. On the raise your hand reaction, I'll show you how to do that. Bing, I've now raised my hand. I've gone over to reactions on the bottom. And now I'm going to lower my hand when I'm finished, another important task. Or you may put a question in the chat box. And Carlin Reed will be monitoring the chat box to make certain that if you have questions, after Laurie presents, those questions can be summarized by Carlin if you prefer not to state them yourself. So welcome, and here we go. Welcome, Laurie Hunter. It's wonderful to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much. So let me pull my slides up. We have 4 articles to talk through, and I'll do them at a high level, given that the timing today allows for that. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So we're going to start with Article 18. Which is the Concord Public School FY23 budget. We are right now working with a recommended budget number that is a 3.4% increase. And I'm going to break this out a little bit, but you can see we've really worked hard to go through, and we always zero base our budget. That means we notice prior history, and especially in COVID, that's worth noting, but we always build from zero up. And we have done that this year. I think you'll notice some ups and downs along the way here. We're going to highlight some of the special education pieces, especially because there's savings in some places and some needs in other places, as well as talking through some of the instructional and supportive pieces. COVID has brought us a lot of needs. Kids have been out of school for consistent purposes for 2 years, and we're certainly feeling the impact of that. Drivers in this budget, then, as would be expected, teacher salaries. You can see some pieces of the tutors as well. Transportation is always a piece. This is especially true of special education transportation. When kids are either within district or out of district, the farther they go, the more expensive, of course. Some other breakouts of salary, contracted services. And then we do have some bits of stipends that is actually a really cost-effective way to build leadership among teaching staff. Cost savers this year, we did reduce another substantial amount of out-of-district costs to CPS to the tune of $603,000. We had some offsets here with the IDEA grant and some with Circuit Breaker, which is the state subsidy that we receive.
Laurie, could you explain what IDEA for
Sure.
the general audience? We try not to use acronyms if we can.
Yes, glad to. And stop me anytime if we do that again. That's the federal special education funding process. So those are federal funds that are allocated towards special education that we have applied. Sick leave and early retirement. We had years ago, almost 5 years ago, started an incentive program, and we're seeing people roll off of that. So as the incentives are paid out, we're starting to save even more funds on top of the salary differentials that we gained when attrition turned over. And curriculum and instruction, we're really streamlining. One of our biggest needs in COVID has been software and electronic access. And we're reviewing that all the time as we are in person now and have different needs than during the peak of the pandemic. I'm going to talk FTEs at a really high level. You'll see it totals to 11 there. Most of that is special education. You'll notice the assistant and tutor lines are up noteworthy amount, as are the teachers. A breakout of that includes a number of special education assistants in our intensive programs. We now run 3 intensive programs at Thoreau to keep kids in district. We run 1 at Alcott and 1 at Willard. We also have 1 at the middle school, and part of this budget proposes building 2 additional so we can complete the continuum, and kids who are in the elementary classrooms that are keeping their needs met have a place to go at the middle school. So you'll see both the teacher and the assistant lines are substantially because of those programs. And like I showed you, it's resulting in these significant offsets to out of district costs. In terms of other outside of the budget income that we want to be sure we're always reporting on, we do receive grant funds from the state for METCO. You can see that's broken out there. Special education, they've been adding to the METCO grant for special education supports for those kids. And I think all the districts are grateful for that because that has been a district level cost up until now. Title I, we're holding on Title I funding at the K-8 level at high school. We're actually no longer eligible because it's based on demographics. And preschool tuition, a few years ago, we were able to work with the town to build a revolving account that we now access the tuition that the community students pay to attend. Special education students attend for free. Community kids pay tuition. So we're now applying that to the cost of preschool staff. Just in terms of numbers to go with the tuitions, you can see the totals and the offsets that I mentioned with circuit breaker and the federal grant. Circuit breaker is really the state version of grant money for special education costs. And when you look, you can see the numbers have declined substantially. And this is the continuum of a 3 to 4 year trend where we're keeping kids here, and that's better for kids as well as fiscally prudent. We always want to mention transportation since we have such the privilege of owning our own buses, which I'll tell you in COVID has been essential because we've been able to stay up and running thoroughly, really well supported by our team of drivers. So that's the breakout of where we are both with driver FTEs, and we've been successful at retaining drivers, which I think, as you know, has been an ongoing challenge in other districts. And the fleet is named here as well. And the age of the fleet, the Lion 217 is the electric bus that's running. We have 2 up and running right now, 1 here and 1 at the region, and a 3rd on the way. And we're always interested in continuing that when there's funding to support it, which is the challenge at $300,000 a bus. We wanted to be sure as a conclusion to this overview that we named some of the other funding sources that have been pandemic driven. Boy, talk about acronyms, Diane. I won't define all of these. You can generally consider them COVID funds, either from the state or from the federal level. And so we're tracking these, trying to be sure we're being really thoughtful about our usage of them so that they're supportive to the budgets over the next few years. You can see the last round of federal funding called ESSER 3 is available through 2024. So we're using these really carefully and thoughtfully and trying to be sure we're not creating any cliffs where we're funding ongoing costs with one-time funds, because that's a problem to come later if you do that. We did have to do a public input process to break out where these funds are going to target. So we just included that here. We're looking at some funding to summer school, which is about helping support learning needs that have been magnified with the school disruption. Literacy is a very big priority for us, so we've allocated pieces there. We actually are targeting some of our funds here to getting those special education programs off at the middle school, and social emotional, those needs have increased. We were already in mental health crisis prior to COVID. We certainly see the needs even greater now. And so there's a guidance counselor there to be consolidated likely when the new middle school opens. So that is a high level view of Concord's budget. I'll just name, and Chris is here, we've talked about this even in the last few days. We are not a guideline. We're still in conversation and scheduled a joint meeting with FinCom next week to talk about where we are and what to do next. So I will shift gears to the capital side of Concord budget. So this, let me screen share. Can you see that? Great. So our capital projects are all built within the town manager's allocations. So we are working within the $900,000 that has been allocated through the town's budget. I'll just mention each of these briefly. This is part of our 5-year capital plan. So you're just seeing the FY23 part of the plan. The school committee reviews that with us several times a year and updates it at least annually so that we're meeting the needs at the K-8 schools and always trying to be in preventative maintenance and proactive energy usage. That really is our approach. So highlights of what's in this year's plan are capital and tire replacements at the elementary schools, starting to change. Some of those are over. The schools are 10 to 15 years old, and we want to be sure we're maintaining them appropriately. Alcott, we are in the 3rd of 3 phases to upgrade the systems there for heating and cooling. And I know we've had discussion with community groups about how if we could go electric. This project was planned out as far as almost my whole time here, which is almost 5 years, with the goal of being higher energy efficient and also having reliable heating and cooling. We've had some issues with that as well. So timing really drove the decision, and we've now done ERUs, replaced the air conditioning. And the last piece is this last boiler. And yes, it's not electric, but it will be by far better than what we have now. To slow this down would be pretty challenging in terms of usage of the previously installed work. And electric takes on a lot of costs that we would need to talk about as a community. We very much want to have that conversation about Thoreau and Willard. Thanks to COVID and a fire, we haven't touched Thoreau and Willard yet. So there's a real opportunity for the community to engage with us about the option of going electric there. We want to be sure everyone knows that's absolutely a discussion we want to have. We've allocated funds towards an integrated playground at Thoreau that's more accessible for some of the special needs programs that are now housed there. Ripley's becoming another driver for capital funds. Not a lot has been done at Ripley in a long time, and that we want to be sure we're keeping things safe, being energy efficient, and making sure we're not letting this building, I'm sitting in Ripley, so I'll say this building deteriorate, because that'll be more costly over time. So we're looking at replacing flooring, paving and sidewalk replacements outside. And this is phase 1 of several. We've actually been working on a green community grant with the town for the heating system here at Ripley. And you'll see that in upcoming capital budgets. Green communities will subsidize it. We have a lot of electric upgrades to do before we're going to be eligible to make the heating improvements. But I think Ripley's going in a really great direction toward electrification and really great energy usage that fits in with the town's goals. So we're excited about that and the partnership there. And for the time being, we're going to hold the $100,000 for the middle schools. This is just our backup because we're never sure what's going to happen next in those buildings, and having funds available has proven to be an important way to maintain those schools operationally until the new school's online. So those are the CPS budget items. I will switch to the regional pieces now. Let me screen share this. So at the region, let's start with the great news. We are a guideline here, and we'll give you the highlights of the regional budget. So our breakout now, we're coming in with a recommended budget here at 2.19, we had some unexpected revenue come in from the state as they've readjusted their formulas. So that allowed us to close any gaps that we had. I'll talk through each piece. This is both budgets, with the exception of some special education program at CPS, are very much level service, and that's been the goal. We're able to reallocate and rename funds so that that maintains a reasonable increase to the communities. That's incredibly important to us. So that'll be the mindset we use going forward for sure. Budget drivers in this high school budget, so this is where it's no perfect formula and why we want to be sure we're continuing to build programs. And we did have an increase in out-of-district tuitions there. We are building a language-based program at the high school, which will meet some of the needs that resulted in that. Additionally, we had 2 students move in that we had not expected. And so that's, I think a lot of you are very aware of the fluidity of special education tuitions and the unknowns that can happen. So that did become a driver here of substantial amounts. Otherwise, it's a pretty level budget with no huge increases other than our contractual obligations. I do want to call out our DEI director, which is split between both budgets. It's our first year of his presence and the important work he's doing to lead us through our work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so he's embedded in both of these budgets and split between them. Cost savings that we were able to realize at a high level. There's certainly smaller amounts along the way. Contracted transportation, which is our special education transportation. Contracted services, we're always reviewing those for needs and what the services they're providing are and the purposes, and rebuilding that every year so we don't, we only build what we need. Leases, we have some laptops rolling off of their lease, so that's exciting to see that come down. And then debt, which is against the high school project, is also reducing. FTEs here, very minimal. 3 FTEs can be just little bits of change. We build our FTE plan based on student schedules and adjust up and down 0.25 at a time. So the one language-based teacher is there, but otherwise it's a fairly stable level service staffing plan.
Sorry, can you explain what language-based teacher means?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we have students, I'm going to overgeneralize just for ease of understanding, students who might have dyslexia, who need ongoing support, because to access any curriculum, the reading ability has to be part of that discussion. So they receive supports in all of their content areas to make sure that their content access doesn't have detrimental impact because of any reading potential issues that they might have. That's a really big focus of us, frankly, elementary on through the high school, is to service those students more effectively in district. That is one of our patterns of kids who've gone out most recently. So thanks for asking, Diane. Great question. Want to be sure we name the other accounts and inflows of revenue, which at the high school is quite a batch. Again, Metco, we receive high school funds as well. Students pay a parking fee, so you can see that's named here to help support our campus security plans and staff. Just a little background in terms of the numbers of the special education tuitions and where the funds are coming from. Again, usage of circuit breaker from the state funding, IDEA from the federal funding certainly applies and helps to subsidize those. You'll see this is the little uptick that we had in out of district. And I will name, we're working very closely with Carlisle because that's another variable at the high school that we don't have at CPS, and really excited. They're building in-house programs too. So I think that will continue to have impact for us and keep our kids in the community. E&D, excess and deficiency, is our, for lack of another term, stabilization fund. Essentially, we're allowed to carry over 5% of the operating budget. And you can see we're right at that, which has been great growth for us. It wasn't that long ago that we were under 3%. And actually, we're getting feedback at the time for concerns over not having enough. We are right at the 5% right now, which is a really strong fiscal position to be in. We do use some of that towards revenue to the budget. So there's some ins and outs that happen, but we're really excited that we're able to stabilize that. We have the same need to watch our post-employment benefits, or OPEB, as the town does, because the region needs to supply that as an entity unto itself. The formulas keep changing with how you measure your position in terms of OPEB. It's now about percentage of what you're funding rather than a set cost amount. You can see we're on track to be at 30% as of 2020. And we're going to continue to look at this. We're in really good shape compared to most regional school districts. We knew that was the value of the community and the town's approach to fiscal management, and we have worked really hard to follow suit. Quick overview of transportation for the high school. You can see FTEs in the fleet. We continue to replace buses so that the fleet is current. Wasn't too many years ago we had gotten behind and really had unreliable opportunities there for the vehicles themselves. So stabilizing that's been successful. And now we're really actively looking at the opportunities for electric, and are working with Amanda and other members of the strong sustainable community in town to see how to make that doable.
Yeah, Laurie, can you explain who Amanda is?
Oh, sorry, Amanda Combs, Concord Sustainability Director.
That's
you.
Exactly right. Thank you.
Yeah. Health insurance, the region needs to supply the employer portion of health insurance, which the town does on the Concord side, the CPS side. So this is where we're at with active employees and retirees. We're always watching increases that come along every year and making sure we're monitoring that. It's been very successful collaboration with the town to offer different plans and higher deductible plans, and really try to do well by both the employees and the district and town side of things. So that's an area of some satisfaction. Debt service, this is the declining chart of high school debt coming off of the building. So you can see it's in that downward trend, which is good news, and good news to both Concord and Carlisle. And then lastly, we wanted to be sure we mention the COVID funding coming from the state and the federal government. This is the overview of that. You can see it broken out. In terms of our plan for the biggest grant is to use that toward some of the literacy and academic needs. Again, with a gradual plan so that the operating budget doesn't need to take a huge hit later on down the road. So we're making these costs a split throughout the operating years. And then just highlights of the income, because we receive the aid directly at the region versus the town receiving it. Highlights of different pieces of where our revenue is coming from, whether it's state aid. We do get regional transportation reimbursement at the high school. You can see the status of E&D revenue. We're using 300,000 and some other smaller amounts. And then this is what breaks out the proportional share to both communities. Concord's at a 77.41% share of students, Carlisle at 22.59. That's very stable from last year. Sometimes this can really swing and have a real impact on either community. We've had quite a bit of conversation with Carlisle because they are going to be seeing their percentage increase as Concord's comes down a little and theirs comes up a little, and they're going to need to prepare for that, which Concord's had to do in the past. So we're always trying to project for either group. And that's where we land on the bottom line. In terms of Concord, we're at a 3% increase without debt, and less than that if you include debt. And I think really excited that we've reached a really solid budget at a reasonable rate and come to agreement with both towns. So one last one while we're on the region is a separate warrant article, because we have a long-term need that we're hoping to finally resolve with the roadway out in front of the high school, which loops in front of the Beatty Center, connects Thoreau and Walden Street. So this will seem familiar because we brought it forward 3 years ago and included parking, which, let's stress right up front, there is no parking request here at all. All we're asking is to consider repaving and rebuilding the roadway. So we've been working closely with the DPW and in-town engineers. We're really grateful for their support and the work they've put in to provide us both a plan and keep costs down to build the plan. They went out and reviewed the road recently to give us a rating, which Alan Cathcart, your DPW director, now uses for all the roads that he brings to ask for support on. Not surprising to us, it came up poor on their rubric because it's not been attended to in so long. It wasn't part of the building project, so it pre-exists the construction and opening of the school. So we're looking at estimated total costs of just over $1 million. We were able to get to that number with consolidated efforts to be included in the bid process with the town and benefit from the scaled bidding process that the scope would include us. The regional school committee last June, in some of the ups and downs of COVID, there was some funding left at the end of the school year. They allocated that to the regional capital stabilization account, which is different than other stabilization accounts in town. It's a regional account. So they put 200,000 in there. We are now looking to use the 200,000 towards this project and reduce the costs to both towns to $850,000 split between the two communities. So we're trying all efforts we possibly can to come in as low as possible on this. The breakout of the project is updates and replacements of the lighting for safety reasons and really to make it a better campus and safer to be at night. That's about $250,000. And then the road costs are at about $830,000. We've got drainage issues, curb replacements that need to be done. It's pretty much a rebuild of the roadway entirely, which is very much needed. Pictures worth 1,000 words. These are the pictures from 3 years ago, which we'll scan through just really quickly. It's just one big patchwork of replacing and patching and potholes and trying to keep it safe. We took pictures again a little while ago. It's worse if it's at least as bad and in many places worse. Drainage has become a pretty substantial problem. That's going to have to be done regardless of the outcome of the Warren article. We had some pretty significant flooding issues this winter as the storms came through, snow and rain and backlogging there. So you can just see ongoing cracks and needs all through it. So that is on the warrant in both towns. Just to note process, Carlisle's town meeting is actually before Concord. So they will be voting on it at town meeting April 25th. If it succeeds at town meeting in both communities, it does have to go on a ballot vote. And Concord now, through some discussion of best timeline, looks like the ballot vote would be pushed out to align with the governor's primary in September. And that would still allow us, if passage happens, to work with the town to get this done in the early fall and maximize benefit of their bid process through spring and summer. So that is the overview of what the schools are bringing forward this spring. And I think, Diane, we're ready.
Thank you, Laurie. There's so much to take in, isn't there?
A lot, yeah.
And I put a lot of my questions in the chat box, and I think other people did too. So Carlin, you want to take some of those questions for us? And then if people want to raise their hand, if they have a question, we'll watch for that as well.
Sure, will do. We have about 10 questions, Diane. So you watch the timing of this because we want to leave plenty of time for Christine's presentation as well. A couple of these questions look like they're looking for data, and some of them are looking for explanations. So let's get a couple of the quick data pieces out of the way. Okay. Here's one from Peggy. How many more years do you think the high school building will last?
Well, we have had very little to no needs in the high school, and we're now in almost year 7. So you've built a really high quality school. Our job now is to maintain and do the proactive work to do that. I see no reason you're not going to hit the 50-year mark with what we've seen so far and the quality of the systems that are in place and the tenure that they've had already. I think our job is to be responsible for that and make sure we're proactively maintaining that. But the building's really holding up really well. And I think, you hit the 5-year mark and you start to get a sense of the longevity of what you built. And boy, we do very little work there. And I think that's a great place to be.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. Okay, next one. This is about the DEI. Is the DEI position only a 0.8 FTE?
Yeah, no, great
job, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a full-time job. The reason it's listed at 0.4 in the high school is because that's how we split positions across the 2 districts. The standard balance is 0.6 to CPS and 0.4 to the high school. The CPS budget had so many details. We didn't pull that up and show you the 0.6 as blatantly, but the other balance is over there in the K8.
Because I know that he does more than a full-time job.
Yes, that's right.
I was pretty astonished.
All right. Do you know how many Concord kids, K through 12, are in the special education program?
Oh, what a great question. Our percentages have been dropping some as we build out regular education interventions. We're now close to the state average. I'm going to guess at these a little, so don't hold me to it, but we're at 17-ish%. We've been as high as 22. And that's the good news there is that's not us under identifying kids. That's us intervening earlier, building out more supports in regular education so that it might be a shorter term need rather than a longer term need. So we're on par with the state average right about now, which I think is not a bad place to be. We'd love to continue to see that decline while we serve kids well. So thank you.
Good. Okay, let's go along with that intervention identification piece. How many Concord kids are, this is a preschool question. How much does preschool cost a parent? And what kind of offsets are available to reduce that cost?
Sure. I don't have the tuition number off the top of my head. We can get that for you, but there are subsidies available. We have to build that against the same sort of subsidy that we build. Any charge to parents has to be matched up against the free and reduced lunch eligibility, and make sure that anyone with needs is offered that. So it's available to anyone. Cost is not prohibitive. We're bringing in about $70,000 in tuitions for the total of each half of the year, for a total of $140 a year. But again, there's subsidies available and we actively offer those and support people with them.
Okay, if it's okay, if you don't mind, I thought I saw Jared raise his hand about the
I bet he's clamoring to answer that since I didn't know it. Yep. Go
It's
ahead.
the only thing you don't know. The only thing in 3.5 years. Hi, everybody. It's about $3,500 for a halftime. I don't think we have any full-time paying preschoolers, but it's about $3,500.
$3,500. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Jared.
Okay, now let's go to some of the more textual questions. Mental health. You mentioned that we have a mental health crisis. What does that mean? And what are you experiencing? What are you doing about it?
Yeah, great question. Our kids, and let me talk a little pre-pandemic and then pandemic impact. Pre-pandemic, the pressures and demands on kids, which demand sounds like a negative word. It's often a positive word, that they're, really engaged and doing a lot and really benefiting from all a school can offer. But it can really be crushing for some kids, that they feel they have to be perfect. They feel they have to be highly engaged almost to a fault. And then they're doing homework very late at night. The drive in a community like ours to be sure your resume build for a high quality college starts really, really early. Feels like it starts early and earlier. And really, we're just trying to balance that so kids don't miss the journey on the way to the outcome and really find joy in what they're doing, feel engaged in their learning, and feel connected to each other. So it's a balance of the priorities that we're really striving for. You certainly don't want to sacrifice quality of academics for all of that, but just try to help them be able to see their worlds as a big picture, and that they are a whole person and have to feel good about themselves in so many ways. So we've been doing a lot of work with Challenge Success, which is an organization that comes out of Stanford University, which helps schools to really look at all the structures and systems they have in place that might be adding to the problem instead of alleviating it. Often schedules, homework's a hot one for sure. Helping kids build coping strategies, time management, choices that they make, et cetera. The pandemic took all of that and added this layer of, at least 18 months of extreme to partial isolation and lack of social connection, which is a lifeline, and the through line for joy for kids and being together. And so we have definitely seen outcomes of that and rebuilding of kids' experiences with each other, the way in which they interact with school, kids prone to anxiety and those types of mental health pieces have really had that completely exacerbated, and just a lot of support needed. And by support, I mean, that means we're trying to do it at a big picture lens. So teachers see the kids as coming off of that kind of disruption, balancing out and being flexible, all the way to the needs for direct services with their guidance counselor, or really acute needs with adjustment counselors and psychologists. And as you know, the mental health system is very broken. So more and more tends to land on the schools and how we can be supportive to kids and families to get support in the schools and connect to outside services. So that's a whole presentation unto itself, but it certainly is a part of what would drive our asks.
And unfortunately, we only have a couple of minutes left for this part of it.
Okay, let me give you two more questions.
As we all know, this is a 2-hour session, so we do have some flexibility in terms of time, but go ahead. Yes, Carla.
Okay. This is from Marge. Elsewhere, vaping is again on the rise. What's the situation at the high school?
We had a pretty substantial vaping challenge pre-COVID. We have not seen it return so far. We're keeping an eye on that. The kids were, one big interesting piece, we supervised every bathroom last year because of COVID. And that tends to be a place where kids congregate for that sort of thing. So it just eliminated the problem. It was an interesting silver lining to the pandemic. We have not been aware, I'm sure it is on the uptick, but we have not gotten back to the same level of concern, at least in the school usage. We know it's still a need to be sure kids are very well educated and continuing to monitor it. So great question, because certainly on our radar.
Okay, last one that I have, Diane, is deals with the budget. What's the relationship between salary savings due to early retirement and the increase in OPEB costs for those retirees? And this question is from Stefan.
Yeah, and Jared might want to pop on and can back me up. I'll start it. We pay as we go with the retirees as well as contributing to OPEB. So we're always trying to make sure we're not making those demands on the budgets later any bigger than they already are. Do you want to add to that, Jared?
Jared, you're muted. You're still muted.
How about now?
Now you're good.
All right. I've only been doing Zoom now for 2 years.
I know. We'll have a special help for you in the future.
That's right.
So Stephen, that's a very good question. And I think, Laura, you explained it well. Right now, we contribute about $550,000 in our general fund budget to offset the OPEB cost. And we do pay as we go, but it's important to note that we have, I want to say about 35%, give or take, of our OPEB fund fully paid. I think it's up in 2039, the way that they do the report. And we're also maybe the highest, we have the highest in our account of any region in Massachusetts. There might be one other one. So right now, again, we use that 550 to offset. I believe in FY23, because the report came back after we had already put this number in, that might even be a little bit higher than what they're telling us that we need to put in. But whatever they tell you, they say you want to do about 80% of that, because that sort of averages it all out. So obviously, the more people that retire, your OPEB does go off, but hopefully you do replace those retirees, which we do, with a lower with a lower employee on the salary.
Thank you, Jared. Okay, Diane, it's back to you.
Thank you, Carlin, and Laurie, thank you so much. I don't know if you can hang around with us for a while in case questions come up toward
Sure.
the end. It would be fantastic if you could.
I
know
definitely
you've got
can.
an incredibly busy schedule. Christine Reynolds, here she comes, chair of the FinCom, really an enormous responsibility in our town. And Christine is going to talk with us about the various initiatives that FinCom has on our warrant. Welcome, Christine, and thank you.
Thank you, Diane. So hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to try and cover the highlights of the articles that FinCom is involved with and has been considering over the past couple of months. But at first, I wanted to set some context. The Finance Committee is a 15-person body appointed by the town moderator to advise town meeting on matters impacting the town, in particular financial. We spend many hours reviewing such matters, primarily the operating budgets, which we're going to talk about today. We also sponsor public hearings on those articles, and we make recommendations on the articles about how the town should vote. And then we publish a report about 2 weeks before town meeting, which summarizes our recommendations. This work is still in process, so I'm going to cover some highlights, as I mentioned today, but I really encourage you to read the report before town meeting. It includes important information on budgets and articles. It has lots of data, and it also includes a 5-year projection of tax growth. So please take a look at that. Don't substitute this recording for that. So I'd like to start with the operating budgets first, and then I'm going to talk about free cash, and then I'm going to get to some other articles that I think would be of interest to citizens, but I won't cover everything. So why don't we get started? Does that make sense? I think that'll
Perfect.
work.
That's
Okay, good. So let's talk about the operating budgets. So every year, the Finance Committee develops a spending guideline for each of the 3 budget units: the town, Concord Public Schools, and the Concord Carlisle Regional High School. The guideline is it's a dollar and percent change based on the prior year budget. So that's all it is. And that guideline is really aimed to balance the continued delivery of quality services in town we're balancing that with affordable tax rate growth. We developed that guideline after several meetings with budget units to discuss where they are in their current year spending, where they've been trending, what their needs are, what they would like to do from a service model in the coming year, any trends that they see. We also look at local and national economic factors like inflation and unemployment. We also have something that the FinCom developed called the sustainable growth rate, which is close to a proxy for inflation that we use to evaluate the change in the budget. And we look more broadly at longer term capital needs. So what are the other plans that the town is looking at in terms of spending that could impact taxes and things like the middle school. So we take a look at things like that. So we consider all those things. We meet with the budget unit several times to discuss that. And then in December, we publish guidelines so the budget units can consider those as they develop their final budget requests for the next fiscal year. So in December of 2021, FinCom issued guidelines for the budget units as they develop the budget for FY23, because that's what we'll be voting on in the FY22 annual town meeting. Okay, so what did we recommend? So for the town, we recommended an increase of 1.1 million or 3.56%. For Concord Public Schools, it was an increase of 1.1 million or 2.7%. And for the high school, it was an increase of 800,000 or 2.2%. That all adds up to a total budget increase of 3 million or 3.3%, which would result in the impact to the median tax bill, an increase of 3.23%. So that's what we came out with in December. So that was FinCom's final guideline. So where are we today? So the town met the guideline. As you just heard, CPS is over the guideline by about 300,000, and the high school has met the guideline. So that's where we are today. So I'm going to pause for questions on the guidelines, if there are any.
Diane, I don't see any in the chat, but I do have one that I think may help the discussion.
Okay.
Christine, could you explain a little bit more what sustainable growth rate is and how it reflects reality?
So sustainable growth rate was developed in, I think, 2019, I think, by FinCom. So it was something that we decided to start looking at. So we developed it. It's a simple calculation, frankly. It's a measure of local consumer price index growth, as well as the 10-year yield on treasuries. So which is a forward-looking look at inflation. So really, it's tied as it was calculated or developed as, I believe, a proxy for inflation. So it was one of the measures that you could look at when we were evaluating cost growth in the town.
I have a simple question. I'm sure you do comparisons with other towns. Is a 3.2% increase in our tax rate in Concord comparable to what you see in other towns? Is it high or is it moderate?
It depends on, what you want to have for comparables, right? So they're not all, we do look at it, Diane. So we look at Lexington, Wayland, Sudbury, Wellesley. So we look at towns that, are similar in size and service level to what we would have in Concord. And it depends. So it really depends on what's going on in the town. But I wouldn't say that the 3.23 is out of whack with the others. We think that's about where we need to be.
Okay, thank you.
We'd even like it to be a little lower, but three and a quarter doesn't look too bad to us.
Okay, thank you so much. With the pressures of inflation, which we are all hearing about a great deal, do you anticipate that this will be that we will be providing sufficient funds given increasing costs?
Well, it's a good question. So we think we will, because obviously we have the folks who have to pay the bill will have those same impacts on inflation on their spending as well. So if inflation, right now, we're up at 6 or 7%, right? So depending upon how you want to measure it, if we were to increase taxes at 6 or 7%, I think that would be a pretty tough increase to swallow. So we're balancing it, but it's something we're going to have to watch. No matter what, everybody, the spending units as well as the taxpayers are going to have to probably pay more for a bit less. And so, yes, it's consideration, an important one.
Thank you so much. And so in the chat box, Christine, let's go on to the next part.
All right, good. So now I'm going to speak to the operating budget. So we talked about the guidelines, and now I'm going to talk the operating budgets. So what's an operating budget? So that's what the town and the schools use to provide their services on an annual basis. And it's apart from what I'll call capital spending, which is more for assets with longer life. So if you're having a major new building, or if you're having a change, Dr. Hunter described, they want to do some paving on the road. So significant amounts of capital spending, that's separate from the operating budget. So I'm going to talk about the operating budget, which is what the guideline is aimed at. So that's what the guideline is aimed at, operating budgets. Okay, so Article 9 is the town budget. So the town's operating budget is, they're asking for about 51 million. As I mentioned, they met the guideline. So FinCom has voted affirmative action on this article. So just to describe what we're talking about. So when FinCom evaluates financial impacting warrant articles, we have sort of two options for us. So affirmative action means we suggest the town vote for the item, or no action means we suggest you don't vote for the item. So affirmative action on Article 9. The town is still recovering from COVID. Local receipts are still lower than pre-pandemic levels. And it's noteworthy that for the third year, the town budget has used assumed surplus from the current year to cover some of FY23 costs. So prior to the pandemic, at least for not always, but in years when we have, I'll call it more normal levels of revenue, we typically have at the end of the year a surplus. So what we appropriated for spending ends up coming in less than the revenue we've raised. So we have some surplus at the end of the year. That surplus adds to an account that we call free cash, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But in the past couple of years, because revenue at the town has been down, mostly tied to local receipts from restaurants and retail organizations, hotels, and so forth. So those revenues have not, they've been down, quite a bit, over 20%. So because of that, the surpluses have not built up, and the town has tapped them essentially to fund the next year's budget. And we're doing that again for FY23. So we've assumed about, I think it's 600,000 at this point that we would have for surplus in FY22 that we would apply to the FY23 budgets. So we are in a tighter, we're in tighter revenue, and that's impacting us on the budget side. So just to keep that in mind. It's pretty much a level service budget. The growth in it is driven by two items: the need to bring town salaries to competitive levels and benefits. So those are the two items, if you go through all the categories in Article 9 that you'll see. There's a $1.1 million increase in salary reserves, and that's intended to be able to bring salaries to competitive levels in FY23. On the benefit side, you'll see that health insurance is up about 13%, and that's really driven by premiums. So that's a very substantial increase, and it's driven by the premiums on the town's health insurance. Outside of the budget, as you're probably aware, the town is in receipt of, or a grant of about $5.5 million from ARPA, the American Recovery Protection Act. And that's a federal program. The select board and town manager are in the process of determining how those funds will be used and allocated. But there has been a determination that they would take about $500,000 of ARPA and add that to, it can be used for premium pay for frontline workers associated with COVID. And so in addition to the amounts that I mentioned to you here that come from the operating budget, there is about $500,000 planned to come from ARPA also to deal with compensation in the town. The only other item of note that I would point out in the town budget in terms of changes, you'll see a pretty significant drop in public safety. And I wanted to point out that that's not a decline in services there. What's happening is, in the past, pre-COVID, there was an offset in those expenses related to receipts from parking meters. And as you're aware, during COVID, those parking meters were not being used. So the FY23 budget assumes a reintroduction of parking meters, and the revenue or fees associated with that is once again offsetting the cost in public safety. So I just wanted to point that out. So that's the town. So I'm going to again pause there to see if there are any particular questions on the town budget or FinCom's vote.
I think we have one in the chat box, Carla.
Well, I've got two here. One of them is more specific than the other. The specific question is, should ARPA funds be used for affordable housing, or should affordable housing be paid for from free cash? You've had a discussion about this concept recently, in the
Yeah.
connection with the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust funding.
Right.
How's that going? That's the context.
Yeah,
That's the first one.
okay, yeah, I tell you what, so we're gonna talk about what's in free cash and how we get to it in a minute. So I would say that affordable housing can be funded from either. The particular situation in the town is gonna make it, in my opinion, better for us to be funding it through ARPA because we don't have, we may not have enough money in free cash to do it. It depends on how the ARPA money actually comes into town, but it can be funded from either. I don't think ARPA allows that sort of item as eligible.
Okay, quick follow-up on that. When you said we may not have enough, that means, by that you mean we might fall below that magical 5% threshold? Is that what you mean by not
That
having enough?
is absolutely correct, right?
Okay, and then
I
explain
think
what
that
the,
we will.
what's the 5% threshold? Then I promise I'll stop asking.
Okay, so free cash, the town has a fiscal policy that aims to keep free cash within 5 and 10% of the ensuing year's budget. And we, right now, so free cash that was certified by the state as of June 30, 21, our last fiscal year, is in the 6% range. And if we vote at town meeting to appropriate some items from free cash, we will be at the floor prior to any money being appropriated for affordable housing.
Got it. Thank you. One last, and then we'll get back to your next section. And this is a kind of a philosophical question. Why do we focus on level service funding instead of, and I phrased it as level budget funding, what we paid last year? So level service first, maybe there's a different phrase. Level service mean keep providing the services even though the cost of those services keep going up, versus, all right, Public Works Department, you get the dollar amount that you got last year and no more. You have to make do with what you have. Why do we focus service over budget? That's the question.
Yeah, I don't think that we do. So you know, what Dr. Hunter described in the schools is they have a zero-based budget process where they start fresh every year and build up from the bottom. In the town, they don't have that same process, but from a FinCom perspective, we're not looking for, we don't go in asking for level service. We have the budget groups come to us and say, what do you think you need to do? And then we talk about how much can we afford to pay you to do that, right? Based on what cost growth is. But it's a very good question. So when we evaluate it, we don't assume that there's going to have to be changes in service cuts. So the way that, let's talk about COVID, because that's where we really talked about it quite a bit. So we had, as I mentioned, very serious reductions in revenue in FY 21 and 22, beginning back in FY 20. And one of the discussions that we had with the towns and the schools was, okay, is this a permanent reduction in revenue or is it transitory? If it was permanent, then we would absolutely have to have some cuts in services to make the budget balance. If it's not permanent, if it's temporary, then it's something that we have to pull certain levers to provide savings on, but attempt to hold headcount, which is essentially our main driver in costs in the town, hold headcount flat if we can, and keep going. And so you had to cut around it, if you will. So I guess that's my best way of answering. It depends on what's going on. Sometimes we're really worried about, can we maintain a level service or not? And sometimes there may be changes in town that require you to say, okay, we're going to have a different service. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't say, well, then what service is deprioritized? And that happens at the budget units as well as in FinCom discussions. So I don't think there's an assumption that everything has to be the same. And that's a very good question, though.
Thank you. Okay, why don't you move on to your next section unless Diane has got something?
Yes, thank you so much, both Christine and Carlin. I just want to remind people that the FinCom is an advisory group and not and cannot, in fact, force a certain position. And so that while the town respects the work of FinCom, your hands are often tied, are they not, Christine? And I hope I hope at the end of all this, you will remind people of how that distinction, how that plays out in terms
Sure.
of the good work you're doing. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so that's the town. That's a big budget there. So let's go on to the schools. And let's go to Article 18, which is the Concord Public Schools, which Dr. Hunter took the group through. So I'm not going to spend time on its budget. So, pardon me. So Finance Committee voted no action on Article 18. And what we would propose is at this point, so obviously we need a budget. So the difference that we have, which is around $300,000 on the budget. So FinCom would bring an amendment to town meeting to say, let's reduce the amount that's been approved by this full committee by $300,000 to get it in line with the FinCom guidelines. So we may bring that amendment to town meeting. So we voted no action on the proposed budget, but would propose the FinCom budget, which is about $300,000 less.
Thank you, Christine.
And,
We
yeah.
have a very informed audience right here with us this morning, but not everybody's going to understand what no, what the no vote means, because it's an odd phrase.
Right. Does that explain it?
I mean, no action means what?
Means we don't suggest you vote for it.
That's exactly right. Thank you.
Okay. So why? So why do we have no vote? So the budget as proposed is 3.45% higher than last year. The future growth in CPS budget is projected at 3.76% through FY27. At the same time, the town will be absorbing the cost of a new middle school, which is quite significant. So there's also demands on other town resources around infrastructure, affordable housing, transportation initiatives, green initiatives, and so forth. So we have two questions that we're trying to answer. We would like to understand why the guideline cannot be met. And we would like to see a slowing of cost growth at CPS if we can. And discussions with the school committee and the superintendent continue. So that's sort of where we are on the CPS budget. And that's our rationale. I'm going to pause there again if there are questions on CPS.
We have a couple of them, Diane. Christine, here's one. If FinCom proposes an amendment with lower funding, will that include where in the budget the reductions are to be made? Or do you plan to leave that up to the school administration?
We absolutely be left to the school administration. So we do not make cuts on line items in the school budgets or anywhere else. So we look at it at it from a top-down level, at the overall level. So no, it would not be any specific line item adjustments.
Okay, there was some discussion about that at the last meeting. That's why it's a very pertinent question. All right, and the second question that's up here is, will FinCom be willing to increase its guidelines to reach an agreement on the school budget?
Yes, of course. Of course. So that's a process that we go through. We'll consider it. Absolutely.
Okay, well, that's good news. That means there's hopefully the two of you to negotiate. Diane, that's it for the questions that we have in the chat at this point. So we can go on to the next section unless there's something
Great.
else.
On to the next section.
Okay, terrific. So now Article 21, which is the high school. So that one is, as Dr. Hunter mentioned, is an increase of, came in, I think, at 2.2% or so. And we have voted affirmative action on the high school operating budget. And that's it for the large items on the operating budget. Dr. Hunter took you through the capital requests, Article 22 for the high school, and I think it's, I'm not going to know I don't remember the number. There's also a different article for the amounts for the CPS. I wanted to talk about the town for a second. So the town article for capital spending is, let's see here. It is.
Can you remind people which warrant article, what number that is?
Yeah, I'm just looking for it here. Here we
I
go,
think
Article
it's
10. It's
10.
Article 10. It follows Article 9, which is their operating budget. So the town capital spending budget is $6 million in total. FinCom voted affirmative action on this article. The dollars are similar to prior year. The makeup is a bit different. If you take a look at the details, there's a lot of money in there for public works. So 4.1 million out of that 6 million is for public works, which includes spending on roads and highways, which is one of the areas where spending was deferred in particular during COVID, but also in prior years. So in our view, that request appeared very reasonable. The town also has some fiscal policies around the percentage of capital spending exclusive of excluded debt in terms of its percentage of the overall capital request. And I believe this is going to meet those requirements as well. So we're comfortable with Article 10 on capital. And I will keep
Perfect.
going unless there are questions on that.
There aren't, and so please keep going.
Okay, great. Okay, free cash. So let's talk about free cash for a minute here. It's an important discussion, and it's one of our considerations in setting budgets and looking at appropriation requests. So as I think I discussed earlier, but I'll bring it up in here again. So as of June 30th, 21, the end of the last fiscal year, the town had 7.5 million in surplus. That number moves around a bit. So understand, you may hear slightly different numbers, but it was around $7.5 million. And the town has a policy, which I discussed there, about keeping that somewhere between 5 and 10% of the general fund budget. It's around 6% or so at the 7.5 million. FinCom has proposed 2 appropriations from free cash for the annual town meeting. $1 million for FY23 property tax offset, and that's Article 7. And that's essentially giving the money back to the taxpayer. So as I mentioned, some years we are able to create some surplus. Many years we are, frankly. And the past couple of years, FinCom has asked for $1 million of that to be used to offset the next year's tax rate. And so we're asking for that again. The second appropriation that FinCom is asking for from free cash is $500,000 for debt stabilization. So I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So there's a debt stabilization reserve that was established in 2020, and that's for the middle school. It was set up with 2 million. We believe we need to reach 5 million. And so if there are funds available in free cash, we would like to appropriate $500,000 for that reserve. If both of those appropriations are approved, that 7.5 million would drop to 6 million. That is the floor. So that would be at the 5% level. As we know, we have a bond offering that will come up soon related to funds that we need to start working on the middle school. So the town will need to be out in the bond markets looking at debt. And so the credit rating that we get is important. One of the considerations by our rating agency will be the amount of funds in free cash. And so while we are not uncomfortable at 5%, we don't want to go below 5%. So the FinCom appropriations would bring us to the floor. So that's free cash. So and so one of the other articles, Article 24, which is for affordable housing, has in the past been funded from free cash. If these 2 articles are approved, then there wouldn't be enough money in free cash to fund the $500,000 for affordable housing. However, ARPA can be used for affordable housing. And so one of the discussions that the select board is having right now is about where and how to use ARPA and whether this is an item, Article 24, could be funded through ARPA. So they started those discussions. I think they're still having them. And that's where the rub comes here a bit on free cash. We're doing things we typically do. We're at the floor very quickly. So I'll pause there for questions on free cash.
That is such an important discussion, Christine. If the select board were not to decide in ample time before town meeting to put some of those ARPA funds, $500,000 of those ARPA funds toward housing, what would we do with this particular article or other articles?
It's a good question. Well, we could choose to violate town policy, I assume. I would not recommend it. So I think FinCom, and I can't speak for the committee. We have not voted on Article 24 because of this issue. We're looking to understand the funding. So
Gotcha.
FinCom, I don't believe would be in support of violating the policy and going below, in particular, because of what that might imply to rating agencies. We would like, and I just wouldn't recommend that. So I would recommend that ARPA be the source of the funds this year for affordable housing. And as you're aware, Diane, and I assume many members of the league are aware, so the town has been seeking legislative approval to find more permanent financing for affordable housing. And there have been some good developments on that front. So the hope would be that can, that can be the source going forward. And as town revenues hopefully start to come back, we may have more surplus in future years that would allow it. But this year, we're in a bit of a pinch. And as I'll speak to when I talk about Article 20, that the debt service that the town is going to have to start paying, particularly in fiscal 25, is going to be quite large. And if we don't have the $5 million in that debt stabilization reserve, the spike in taxes is going to be quite high. So we're trying to balance a lot of different demands here.
Right. I see that Terry Ackerman is with us and she has raised her hand. Terry, do you have a question?
I just want to answer your question, Diane. The select board is planning to discuss it and take a vote on Article 24 on Monday night. And I believe Carrie LaFleur, the interim town manager, will be making a recommendation on that article as well. So your question about what if the select board doesn't vote by then, I'm pretty sure we will be voting this Monday night.
And take into account the fact that this would come from ARPA funds because there's not been an adjudication yet of ARPA fund distribution.
Well, we have to decide one way or the other, ARPA or free cash. And it's a little bit complicated because of the way the mechanics work with the accounting. And I don't want to get into all of that, but that part will be discussed on Monday night.
Thank you very much. And that's for Terry, for those who I'm sure everybody knows, is the chair of the select board. And that meeting on Monday night is going to be an important one. Thank you so much, Terry. Carlin, are there more questions in the chat box that need to be?
Yes, there's one issue that I brought up that Stefan has also added to it, and I wanted to get Christine's perspective. Article 7. Will Article 7 benefit renters, those who do not directly pay property taxes? Stefan has rightly noted that renters do pay property taxes indirectly through their rent, which is the landlord's cost. But when the FinCom is thinking about, let's hold back $1 million to benefit property, to lower the property taxes, is FinCom considering the impact of that on renters? Because there are quite a few in town. That's the genesis for the question.
I would say, just as you noted, Carlin, it has an indirect effect. But so I would say we don't have a way to lower rent for renters, but it has an indirect rent to property owners who do rent. So we think there's benefits there.
Okay. All right. I didn't think it was quantifiable. All right. That's it for the chat here, unless there's something else you want to deal with, Diane.
No, thank you all so much. Christine, you want to go forward?
Sure. So connected to, now I'm going to go into some other warrant articles, and I'm going to go to Article 20. So I'm just going to give you, Article 20 is sponsored by FinCom. It's asking for a total of 1.5 million be appropriated to that debt stabilization reserve. So as I discussed a little bit there, we wanted $500,000 of that to come from free cash. And there's also an account in town that's called the assessor's overlay. And that is a reserve that's used to pay for tax abatements. And over time, if that reserve is not used, the balance builds up. And the Board of Assessors in, I think it was November of 2021, declared an excess amount of $1 million that they could be used for building up the debt stabilization reserve. So Article 20 asks for the $500,000 from free cash and the $1 million from the Board of Assessors overlay surplus, that be applied to increase the debt stabilization reserve from its level, which is 2 million, to 3.5 million. And that's getting us towards the 5 million that we think is needed to take the peak off of the debt service impact to tax bills in FY25. And this, I would like to share my screen if I can here, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay. Go. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So this is a slide in connection with this Article 20. So this shows exempt debt service or excluded debt service. So excluded debt service is the debt that we have related to large buildings in town. And you can see by the colors here, the different sources of debt. So the blue is town debt. That gray line is related to the Minuteman High School. So we have a portion of that as a member of Minuteman. The orange is the high school, and the green, all of the green, including the little lines there at the top, is what would happen when the middle school debt comes online. So on the left-hand side of this chart is the amount of excluded debt service. So that's the principal and interest payments, pardon me, that the town has to pay on an annual basis. And you can see the sharp increase in FY25 as the debt service for the middle school starts to come online. So the horizontal green lines there over that little dotted line show you that gap, or the gap that the debt stabilization fund could create. It could reduce it by those amounts. And so you see the little dotted line there is the impact at the median bill of debt service. So the solid line shows you what would happen without a $5 million debt stabilization fund to your to the growth in debt service and the tax bill. So that shows you this peak that we have for a couple of years, and then we can start to sort of normalize it. So that the 5 million would take a $900 increase to the median tax bill down to about 400. So that's the purpose of the debt stabilization fund. I want to remind you that it's funded by budget surplus. So it doesn't come from the air. This is taxpayer dollars that we're simply retaining earlier on so that we can smooth a spike in spending during FY25 through FY28. So that's my poor job of explaining what it is we're trying to do with debt stabilization. So I hope that was clear.
That's not poor. I mean, that's really very helpful, Christine.
Okay, good. And then the other little line there, it has sort of little boxes to the right there, and those are operational savings. That's a small part as well that helps lower the impact at the time that the schools asked for the funds, they indicated that the consolidation of the middle schools would result in about $500,000 in operational savings. And so we also built that into the chart. So we assume there's some benefit in debt service that we can apply those savings to debt service in the tax bill. And you can see that that helps as well. So I will stop sharing there, or let me ask if there are questions you'd like me to keep the chart up.
Diane, I have two questions. They don't relate to that chart. They
Okay,
relate to
then-
the assessor's office.
Then let's put the chart down, Christine, and
Okay, I will do that. There we go.
terrific, thank you. And we have one hand raised, so why don't we start with a question in the chat, then we'll go to the hand raised and back to the question in the chat.
Okay, sounds good. The question about the assessor's office, could the abatement process by almost all the owners in one neighborhood throw off the assessor's overlay balances? And I suspect this relates to a recent example of what happened at the Board of Assessors meeting that was just posted online.
Okay. The balance remaining after the $1 million is 2.3 million. So there's a fairly healthy abatement reserve remaining. And I have not heard of any other large demand on it, but so it's difficult for me to predict. And I have not spoken with anybody recently about a recent request, but it's a good question. I think the Board of Assessors was comfortable when they voted the $1 million. It's also noteworthy that every year about $500,000 is added to that reserve. So in the FY23 budget, the $500,000 remains. There was no adjustment to that. So I don't know the answer to that, if there's any particular reason why the $1 million is not available. I'm not aware of it.
David Allen, you have a question.
This not planned, but follows on quite directly. Over here in Canantum, about 100 homes, there was a stark jump in tax bills. There's been quite severe dissatisfaction. It looks as if something went wrong. In fact, the assessors voted a lump rebate immediately, which is also not satisfactory, apparently, to virtually all the homeowners over here. I mentioned this, among other things, it points at what I think is going to be an issue with the assessors, completely separate from this conversation, but obviously also to keep in mind what might be the financial impact going forward. Among other things, it highlights the role of this fund available for these things. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
What was
you.
the amount of the lump adjustment?
I think it was said to be 5%, which didn't begin to deal with this most dramatic jump in increase. The issue, it goes without saying, has to do with comparabilities across town. And while I don't have those details at my fingertips, and excuse me for not having that, nonetheless, it's quite clear that this is going to be an issue going down the road. And I think when there are problems with comparability, it's something that requires quite careful attention.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I believe that assessors meeting is on, you can see it on MMN, Minutemen Media Network, by going to YouTube. It was a difficult meeting, I would say.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I will take a look at that. Okay. Any other questions on the
Chat
debt
box.
mountain chart?
Yes, well, there was another follow-up on the assessor's question, because it is an interesting one. That was about $800 on average per homeowner for the benefit, according to the video. which led me to ask this question about, can the Board of Assessors overlay account be considered as a reliable source of funds for the town's budget? This is the second year we've used funds from the overlay account. Will the town be relying on having funds available for that purpose going forward?
I can't answer that question. It's really, I don't know. It's there. I'm not aware that it was used last year, Carlin. It was used a couple of years ago for technology, I know, in a big way. So it does build up, and I think it's something the Board of Assessors control it. And so I think it's up to that body to figure out if they were willing to release funds. I don't think it's looked at. And again, I don't want to speak for the town. I don't think that the town management looks at it as a recurring source of operating budget, but I think perhaps for things that are unusual, and I think a debt stabilization reserve is a bit unusual, right, for $100 million middle school. So it was considered there. That's the best way I can answer it.
Okay, thank you. I have one other question here, Diane, then I'll ship it back to you. Well, and this does refer to the chart. Thank you very much for the question, Nancy. What does the exempt debt service graph look like in previous years? And how typical is the debt service relative to past periods?
I don't know. Well, it hasn't spiked up like this. I don't think in recent history. So it's around total debts, total excluded debt service. So what's been voted above Prop 2.5 is around 7 million. And I think it's been hovering there, for the last couple of years. As Dr. Hunter mentioned, the high school is now on the downward trajectory. So absent the middle school, you would have seen, about 100, 200, you start to see the debt service drop a bit. But I don't have a perspective to say that, that 7 million is dramatically different than what we've had in the past. I think it hasn't been. I think it's at about there. But building, anytime you're going to add a large, this is the largest debt offering the town's ever had, right? So the high school was of comparable costs, but we had MSBA funding,
Right.
significant MSBA funding. We also shared it with Carlisle. So this is well beyond what we've ever borrowed before. So this is a very significant spike in debt service for, coming forward in FY25.
Thank you for that perspective. That's very helpful. Okay, on to other FinCom items. on the warrant.
Okay, all right. We've gotten through a number of them now. So, okay. As I mentioned, we talked a bit about 24, which is affordable housing. We haven't yet, FinCom has not voted on it. As I mentioned, our questions are around the source of funding. Article 25, we also have not voted on. Article 25 is Assabet Bluffs, and there's a request for $500,000 associated with the town providing funds to the extent that grants that are being applied for would not come in. So we haven't finished our review of that. So that hopefully will get done next week, I'm hoping. So that's Article 25. Article 26, which is CPC. So CPC, the CPC requests, which are a little bit above 2 million, I think, this year. We voted affirmative action on that. It includes primarily the big piece of it is the $1 million in total between open space and affordable housing for Assabet. We did vote affirmative action on overall CPC spending. We thought that the amounts that were requested for Assabet was a fair price. The open space and affordable housing topics align with town goals. And so we were comfortable approving Article 26. There is one article, one component of 26 that we had some further discussion on, and that's the, I think it's open space land for the Junction Village. I think it's a request of 250,000. that's part of, I think that 250 is the beginning of what was to be about $1.5 million for a park associated around open space next to Junction Village or Christopher Heights.
Right.
And the discussion that we had with CPC, which was helpful, is that to the extent that Christopher Heights has not yet gotten building permits and has not yet started their work, that the funding associated with the park for that property would not be provided unless obviously the other project was underway or was approved and so forth. So we just wanted to make sure that that caveat was in there.
Okay.
And I also understand that the $1.5 million for that project has now come down to $1 million, which we think is positive, because just keeping in mind that there's a lot of spending on parks in that same area, because there's another facility being built along the bike trail on the Giroux property. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't over allocating resources to the same area in town for similar uses. But I think we've had good conversation on that, and we are in agreement on Article 26.
Thank you. And as the chair of the CPC, I'm not commenting on your vote in any way, but I'm glad to note that the overall cost estimate has gone down.
So are we. So are we. Then the next one that comes up for me is Article 46, which was a question on starting to do some consulting work related to reformatory branch trail. We took no action, so that is a no vote on Article 46. And that no vote was tied to no funding source being identified. So we recommended that the petitioner perhaps apply for CPC funds next year, but we didn't see a funding source. And that's one of the requirements for FinCom. If you're going to come and ask for money, we need to know where it's going to come from. So that was no vote on 46. And that was all I had. But if there are other questions on other articles, I'm happy to take them.
That's done. You've done this so beautifully. I see a hand raised, Ellen Quackenbush.
Yeah, so Christina wanted to ask you, particularly on Article 46. You said that the FinCom is an advisory board. I wanted to know what typically happens in terms of actions by other committees, whether particularly the select board in terms of Article 46, if the expectation, the typical practice is for the select board to follow your recommendations.
Good question. I don't believe so. I mean, I think they certainly consider it, but they don't necessarily go the same way we go. So it's one of their considerations, but it's up to them to decide on their own. They have a different context than FinCom does. FinCom's view of reformatory branch trail was that's a sort of a broader question, right, about parks and trails uses in the town. That's not the lens of FinCom. FinCom's evaluation of it was very narrow. The select board's evaluation would be much broader. So I could see that people would disagree.
Thank you.
And did you take a position on 47?
No,
Okay.
we did not.
All right. So it wasn't no position. It was just you chose not to take a position.
No, well, we would say we didn't take a position on it because it wasn't a financial matter. So yeah, it had no financial request. So FinCom is not going to take a position on 47.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Ellen, do you still have more questions, or have you just not lowered your hand? Okay, thank you. Carlin, you have some questions in the chat box, I think.
Well, we have several. The question I had was about, what about Article 47? Did FinCom take a position? And you've already answered that one. And I've got a couple people reminding me that there's no money involved in 47, and that's why. So let me broaden out that question, Christine, going forward next year, when FinCom reviews articles next year. If a warrant article does not have a financial component, will FinCom even take it up as part of a hearing? They did this year.
The only reason we did was to avoid having the same, essentially 46 and 47 are very similar. They speak to the same topic. They have different, requests, but they're similar. So there was an agreement between the select board and FinCom that we would take them together because we didn't think it would make sense for the public to have to hear, to hear them in two separate hearings. So it was combined. That was unusual. I hope that answers your question. So typically we wouldn't, but this year we did because it seemed to make sense for the public.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. That's all that I have, Diane, right now.
Terrific. This has been so helpful. Both Laurie, don't know whether she's still with us, but let me quick do. Yep, there she is. Between Laurie and Christine, thank you both so much for spending your valuable time with us reviewing these questions. I presume if people have questions after they viewed this, that they can contact each of you independently or attend FinCom or school committee sessions and ask those questions. So please, as a group of citizens, we hope that the league hopes that everybody will feel free to connect with each of you where questions emerge. Thank you all for joining us today. We've had a rather robust audience and fantastic questions from our audience. It's April 1st and the sun just came out. Who knew? So after April showers, we're finally getting some sun. So have a wonderful day and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.